question's for Jorge. When you look at the price premiums, so you, I'm not sure if I got this right. You said in Costa Rica there were 81 out of the 300.
You have 300 coastal tourist destinations. These are all the public beaches in Costa Rica.
And 81 of those were blue flag certified.
Yeah, in 2008.
Now, is there a drop in price premium if the closer you get to all 300 of them being certified? So if I were to ask the question in USDA terms, if everything in a Safeway were USDA certified, would you still be able to get $1, or so would you charge 50 cents for it?
Well, then it wouldn't be a differentiation label, no, but the way you deal with that, and the Costa Rican government pays that program, is that you gradually strengthen the stringency of the requirement to get the blue flag. Early on in 1998, when the program was launched, it was much less stringent. But even then, not many participated because it requires a great deal of coordination. As more people started realizing that this was a good way to attract tourists to a particular destination, more beaches wanted to enroll in the program. So the government of Costa Rica increased the stringency of the standard. And also they started to drop some of the beaches that had participated early on because they were not meeting the standard. So a couple of things here that are key is you had to constantly look at how stringent the standards are and the audit. You had to drop, actually provide rewards and sanctions for good and bad performance. Otherwise, the program tends to not work very well.
Just to follow up, Jorge, it seems it requires like a critical mass of the potential market to recognize that the flag actually has a premium. And then the second thing seems to be, doesn't this create a gray market where lots of smaller entrepreneurs recognize, sort of proclaiming themselves as environmentally friendly is a way to draw the market? So doesn't it make the market murkier, where everybody's sort of competing by claiming themselves to be ecotourism?
Can you repeat what you said at the beginning?
How does the market come to have value from the consumer viewpoint? Because they're the ones who are willing to apparently pay more money because they see the marker.
Okay, so this is a very interesting question, and it's important to. I didn't get a chance to talk about the limitations of what we do. No? So Costa Rica is unique in many ways. No? It's recognized as a worldwide leader in this type of ecotourism. And other countries have tried to replicate it with as much success as Costa Rica. So in this particular country, because they were first movers early on in this type of tourism, they already have a market of consumers and tour operators that are looking for this type of characteristics, social and environmental responsibility. So the demand is already there, and that's an important. You have to have a significant segment of tourists or tour operators who buy for tourists who are willing to pay for the certification. If we transfer the certification to the Dominican Republic, even if we design it very well and we do audits and we strengthen the standards over time and we require cooperation, it might not work as well because the Dominican Republic doesn't attract, at least as little I know, doesn't tend to attract the significant segment of environmentally aware tourists or tour operators who want this type of labeling. And that's an important caveat.
And that's exactly what's happened in the DR. They have Blue Flag and they have other similar programs, and marine biologists I've spoken with express a lot of frustration because they have these partnerships with hotels to measure coral cover and coral loss and other aspects of marine diversity, and this requirement of the program is that they do this report, and then the biologist goes and presents his report, and the hotel says, okay, thank you very much, now I know my coral's dying, and they go back to doing what they were doing before. So there isn't really an incentive within that market to make a change towards sustainability.
Could we take a question over on this side first?
Hi, first off, thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. Okay, I don't think any of you really touched on this too much, but I'm very interested in the intersection of gender and tourism, because I do think that gender equality is an essential component of any sustainable tourism industry. So my question to all of you is, what sorts of efforts towards gender equality are being made in the tourism sector in your regions of focus? Thank you.
Sure. So one of the interesting things in both of the cases I presented today is that you see dramatic increases in female labor force participation rates in both of those tourism polls. So in that respect, there are increased opportunities for women. There are some instances, for example, in Cancun with the domestic violence crisis, that increased labor force participation is thought to actually be a cause of this changing family structure and this loss of social cohesion and loss of family support, and that sort of shift in family dynamics is thought to have negative impacts within family structure. So I think that there are, within mass tourism in these particular cases, there are advantages and disadvantages that sort of work in both directions in terms of increased economic opportunity, but then also the potential for some social backlash that happens as well. And in both cases, particularly in the Dominican case, less so in Punta Cana, although of course it exists, there is also, with mass tourism, the concurrent rise of the sex tourism industry as well, and particularly in the DR, the exploitation of Haitian minor females as well. So we see sort of multiple layers of those gendered impacts.
The issue around gender is a very important one in terms of our recent study at the World Bank related to Sierra Leonean diaspora investment interest. One of the trends that we found in our survey is that women are remitting money, giving to charity, and are as interested in portfolio investment in Sierra Leone as their male counterparts. However, they are statistically significantly traveling home less frequently. They are statistically significantly less interested in direct investment, going back and starting businesses, and they are less interested in real estate holdings. And that's what the survey tells us. The qualitative interviews that we did with women who had gone home and actually gone through sort of an investment investigation process, or who have actually invested in Sierra Leone, what we uncovered was story after story of sexual harassment and in some cases violence. And that is an issue, with a very small diaspora, with an economy that is contracting almost around 1/4 because of Ebola and other factors. You have a very different kind of development problem if you have to take 50% of that diaspora off the table, because in that particular diaspora, the female diaspora is highly educated, has investment capital, and many are entrepreneurs themselves. So taking a gender lens to diaspora investment issues is extremely important, but not in general, and particularly in Sierra Leone.
Well, regarding certification programs, that's an area that hasn't been paid much attention to yet. Most certification programs in tourism, like whether it's at community level or hotel level, are focused so far on environmental aspects of it. There is some attention to fairness of how much the employees of hotels get paid, but except for the prostitution part, which is a big problem, or the one that gets the most attention, not related to gender, there hasn't been much effort in that area. Now, having said that, I will have to say that you cannot design a program that certifies you for everything, that you are going to resolve all the problems of the world. And might sound cynic, but I think it's an important part of it. You create a green certification, and that certification is going to focus on environmental issues. You want that focuses on human rights. You should create a different one, because otherwise we have the problem of making a market that is murkier. The idea is that you get a price premium for this label, no? But the label has to mean something to you, to the consumer. If you have certification that involves a label that certifies you for all areas of social and environmental responsibility, the label loses meaning to the consumer. And we are less willing to pay more for it. People might say, oh, I like it, but when they actually have to purchase a double room in a hotel, when you are looking at TripAdvisor planning a trip to Cancun in January, the label has to mean something specific to you. And if it's too broad, then it loses its meaning, and accordingly its market value. And I know that's probably not what you wanted to hear, but it's an important thing to consider. If you want to create a label to deal with these issues, it has to be a different label. It cannot be just an add-on to you know, whether I'm saving energy and using chlorine in my pool. And by the way, I also deal with gender issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would probably build on that, say, in some sense, the presentation I give is talking about how are we harnessing a variant of tourism and adapting that for other ends altogether. And so the major prism, in the case that I'm discussing, the SlaveRex project, is not gender per se. Having said that, to the extent that we are trying to think about how to make this project or archaeology developmental, that I think, certainly within the anthropology of development, gender has been mainstreamed. It's no longer sort of a separate silo. It is something that is considered as part and parcel of what you do when you do development. And so that's reflected in, for example, the types of things that we do, whether it's in the capacity building, for example, the majority of the students, the majority of people who are being trained are actually, we have the first female African maritime archaeologists and folks involved in this. And the emphasis is actually, if there's anything, there's a gender bias in that direction. In thinking about things like, I was talking about mitigating income inequality, there's a difference between putting teams in hotels versus in domestic situations that actually have a lower capital entry and in which are often managed by women in these places. So, but I think, I could get into the weeds in that. There are many different examples in which that sort of is a reflexive aspect of thinking about development, and therefore extends into anything that we're trying to put around this notion of developmental archaeology. I guess the only other thing I would point out, though, is that if you move away from this case into the general possibility of how you harness heritage into tourism, and then you deal with this issue of network building, there I think you have enormous potential for things that are well beyond the SlaveRex project. And I think just in terms of, in Liberia where I've done work, there are whole areas that really have the possibility for addressing either social justice issues or bringing people in to engage with a series of problems that may be related, or issues that are related to gender, or in domains in which there's gender differentiation in terms of what people are doing in terms of heritage. So the broader frame has all sorts of possibilities for that are not necessarily forefronted in this particular project.
Two questions for my colleagues. First of all, Jorge, again, follow up on Bob's, comment on the consumer side of the equation, the demand. In your research, did you come across any data or reports, primarily, investigating the characteristics or determinants of the consumers who use those facilities? Because we read a lot, from different organizations, the most educated, the most affluent, type of consumers who use those facilities. And then second question, let me just state this question first for my colleague, Lisa Redo. Fascinating study on the diaspora investment community. And that reminded me of the first wave of the investments in the hotels in China primarily came from the diasporas, from Hong Kong, from Taiwan. And then when I look at the motivations, it fits so well into the four, dimensions. And so I'm very interested. Any other countries you think, such a investment in tourism, hospitality? I'm thinking, potential collaborative research, in some other countries if we have, similar cases. Thank you.
Well, yeah, when you describe higher levels of education, consumers from industrialized countries, they are the most likely to pay attention to the certifications. Another important segment of the green market in tourism is not the individual visitor. because many of us, when we go to a place, even if we don't know it, we buy or we book a hotel through an operator, a tourism operator. They consolidate multiple hotels. So sometimes it's a tour operator in Germany, let's say in Frankfurt, who pre-selects 10 hotels. And then they have a very attractive website where everybody goes and they say, oh, here, I want to go to Costa Rica in March. And then you do a search. No, I want to go to this area, this level of price. And they suggest to you specific hotels. Most people don't do the extra work actually going on their own to look for additional hotels. So a key segment of this green tourism market is not just the individual consumer. Yes, there is a few individual consumers that select their own hotel. But most of us actually buy our hotels through a website that pre-select the hotels that are going to come up as the first suggestion, or the first 5, 10 suggestions. And those decisions about which of these 10 hotels come up first is done usually by the manager of a tour operator, whether it's in Washington, D.C., or in Paris, or Frankfurt. And then, you know, of course, besides levels of education, levels of income are important. Now, another side of it is what are the characteristics of the communities that can do this, that get certified. And you've been talking, here my colleagues have been talking about inequality. Another study that we did, where we include the entire universe of communities, is that higher levels of inequality are negatively correlated with the ability to get these certifications, even if you're a community that has high levels of income, or have easy access to an airport, or has a high presence of hotels, or that is close to a national park. So actually the predictive power of income inequality is one of the biggest ones in the ability to get certified, which is an interesting finding.
Well, I'd like to say that, I'd like to think about this role of tourism in all aspects of diaspora investment. So I think it has wide applicability, but some variations that come to mind are things, you know, not every country has a diaspora that has a strong identity. You know, diasporas vary globally in terms of the degree of, for example, formalization. You know, how many sort of diaspora organizations exist, and how active is the community in that, and so on, versus others. And so, for example, one of the diaspora communities that we're having some discussions with, maybe doing some work with, is the diaspora for Mali, for example. But there aren't as many diaspora organizations. It's not as formalized. There isn't as strong of an identity of we are from Mali and this is therefore what we're going to do for that country. The government of Mali is just getting ready to release its first ever diaspora engagement policy and set of strategies for working with the diaspora. And so I think there is a real opportunity there to start to think about how tourism experiences, the role that tourism experiences can and should play in kind of creating that sort of connection between the diaspora and the country of origin that then could be further leveraged for other types of engagement. That versus a situation like the Indian diaspora that already has a very sort of strong identity. But there, what you have really with the Indian diaspora is a strong affiliation to their province where they come from. So there's that's a different type of thinking about the role that tourism can play because it's much more highly localized and not just sort of national level tourism. So I think we have to, I guess it goes back to some of that great work that's happening in this literature right now around tourism, around the role that tourism plays in identity. We have to understand the diaspora identity first to understand the role that tourism can play for development ultimately.
You just touched on diaspora engagement, policy, and identity, and that leads into my question. Compared to other developing countries that are aiming towards increasing investment from the diaspora, what is the Republic of Georgia doing compared from a policy and infrastructure perspective to the other countries that's made it more successful? You touched on the foreign organizations. I'm wondering, on the policy side, what's different there? And then secondly, do you think, and this is for anybody to answer, the PPP model has been effective in tourism development in emerging markets?
On the policy side, there are a couple of different things to point out. I think every government around the world, it seems like right now, is trying to figure out how to structurally, within their sort of organizational structure, how to grapple with the transnational actor that is the diaspora. You know, we live still in a very state-centered, structured world. And the diaspora is really, it's much more complex than that. And that's sort of like the 21st century problem that I think many governments are trying to deal with. Some governments will put sort of diaspora engagement activities sort of embedded within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but then that kind of keeps it separate from a lot of other domain spaces and ways of thinking and activity sets within government. Others kind of house it within their investment promotion authorities and either create holistic groups related to diaspora activities or charge the investment promotion agencies with doing some of that work. In the Republic of Georgia, as in other countries, they've actually created an entire ministry that is focused on diaspora affairs. So you have an actual minister of diaspora affairs whose main job it is to build those relationships. And that minister, reports directly into the prime minister. And so you have that, therefore puts the diaspora sort of front and center, I think, in a lot of thinking and activity at the national level. So I think that's sort of first and foremost. I think secondly, going back to what I said earlier, I think what's been really interesting about what the Republic of Georgia has done is recognize the importance of tourism. Because it brings people back home to engage them at all those different sort of dimensional levels. We have created here in the United States this Global Diaspora Week. That's been an initiative that came out of Secretary Clinton's role at the State Department. That still continues today. And the Republic of Georgia started to build in during whenever Global Diaspora Week is taking place, they host some diaspora events. They even have a Diaspora 5K. And so I think that the fact that they build in these sort of regular visits and build in a lot of interesting creative activities around those visits, although not a policy, it's, I think, a program that makes that state ministry seem very relevant and meaningful because it's doing something for the diaspora before you ask them to do something for you. I think that's critical.
This is about the reproduction law. Do you see a shift in what countries are producing surrogates and what countries are increasingly demanding surrogates, like more in the developed world, less so in the United States and the Western world?
Yes, the question was, do I see a shift in the countries that are supplying surrogates and the countries that are demanding them? Absolutely, in the ones that are supplying them based on the changes in the rules, which is why India, I think, is still a very popular destination, but it can no longer be for same-sex couples, so they moved to Thailand, Nepal, and rumors are now to Mexico. I think countries are, to the extent that they lighten up their restrictions, then fewer people will leave those countries to go. To the extent that they cover the costs of it, fewer people will go. France has recently come out with much more open legislation, and so I think there's less need to leave France, for example. And then there are scandals that always impact things, such as the ones in Thailand and the Ukraine. It's a moving target.
This is either for Dr. Yu or Dr. Shepard. I'm wondering if we can talk about, say, the commodification. I was just reading a couple months ago a book called Naked Cities by the urban sociologist Sharon Zukin on authenticity. I'm wondering if you can speak about the commodification of the notion of authenticity in cultural heritage, or of cultural heritage rather, in the Chinese context. And sort of it's sort of an open-ended question, but what's playing out with that? Thanks.
I can talk about that in terms of how that term connects with Buddhism. I mean, as an anthropologist, I would say that it's a very problematic term, and I think it's a term that resonates with Europeans and Americans, and it's one of those things that in tourism, I think when you go to non-European or American places, there may be much less kind of concern about maintaining material sites as they're supposed to be. So, I mean, you go to the Great Wall, it's great, but it's not all really old, it's all been fixed up. And I'm not sure from a Chinese perspective that that's that big of a deal. I know in this case with these monasteries and temples, even though it's a World Heritage Zone and things are protected, they're also building brand new temples, one of which is just been finished. And I talked to the monk construction guy in charge. He was like the head guy overseeing the workers. And I asked him, I said, is this a World Heritage Zone? He goes, yeah. And I said, but so everything's preserved, right? He goes, yeah. I said, you're building a new monastery. He said, yeah, it's no problem. There was one here in the 12th century during the Song Dynasty. And what he was really, I mean, he was joking, partly what he was pointing to is, in that space, what we think of as authentic, the space, the land is sacred. So the aura of Buddha in Wutaishan is the landscape. So from that Buddhist perspective, the buildings themselves, I mean, they're there. And, you know, this is a big issue with UNESCO because these buildings are replenished all the time. Every couple of years they're repainted and fixed up. But we invest in the built material culture and they're viewing it as the ground. So there's sort of a disconnect.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. Actually, Professor Wong and I did another study which was published on the water town tourism, actually in the same area, in the Tai Lake area. And, you know, most of the water towns actually all renovated. And a few of them actually completely recreated. It's a big attraction for the domestic Chinese, you know, markets for nostalgia, you know, for heritage, and then, you know, because of the success of those water towns and other water towns in the area wanted to emulate. In order to catch up, they just have to follow, you know, the leaders. And so we visited a number of aspiring, you know, water towns want to be in the tourism development programs, and so they started to purchase the houses along the traditional streets, and then renovated them, and, you know, put in, you know, sewers, and renovate the streets, the houses, and so it's a, you know, a lot of those reconstructions going on. You know, if you use the term, you know, you know, commercialization, and so yeah, there's a lot of those going on, and also, you know, the development put pressures on, you know, some of the latecomers in particular. They just have to invest heavily, and in order to be in the game, and so that's really the phenomenal reality back in China right now in tourism development.
Hi, my name is Yuri Horowitz, and I've been working in Haiti recently, and this is for both of you again on the heritage side. I've been working with an example of a heritage site that's not being changed, driven by the government structures and kind of the macro structures, but more the private citizens that are just through sheer development pressures are degrading from the perspective of protecting the heritage. How would you suggest addressing issues like that that aren't driven by the public sector, but are more driven by just development pressures to protect or rather preserve heritage from the outside? Tell me if you understand my question.
Yeah, I guess my question would be, is it a particular site, and do people living in that place actually value the site?
So that's one of the issues, right? Yeah, is do the people perceive it as heritage, the historic architecture of the downtown core, or say a large monument, fortress up on a hill? The hill isn't so much threatened; it's more the downtown core that's being developed, and people are adding stories onto buildings and not staying true to the historic architectural styles.
This is a pyramid.
Well, you know, in the development, and, you know, the pressure is really coming from the developers, they wanted to have, the piece of land, and so they can develop. So for instance, just the Yangchenghu Peninsula TVD, and actually there were 3 natural villages, in that particular site. And so very early on, 10 years ago, those villages all relocated. And so the whole site was cleared for development. And so that's why, I think it's really like the industrial district model. The Chinese government really model after the industrial district. And actually this site is right to the north of the Suzhou Industrial Park. And by the way, our GW has a campus there in the industrial park. And so the pressure from the developer and the government, typically will cater to their needs, and also the government revenue, chiefly coming from renting the land, and they sell the land, but the government still controls the the right of the land, and so typically in transactions like that, and a lot of those heritages, authentic villages and land objects typically were removed, and so you will see a totally completely newly created districts like that, and also neighborhoods. The whole neighborhoods in the cities. There are many those examples. But however, there are also places, Suzhou is one of the cities, I think, has done a pretty good job to preserve the inner core city of Suzhou. And then I was talking to Hannah the other day, and a city not too far away called Changzhou, and they have a part of the old city, and the government is really taking care of it. And even though it's, the infrastructure is dilapidating and needs a lot of work, but the city is doing it. It approaches in a very careful way, and also looking for best model to, redevelop the whole area. And so you have different cases in different cities, but most of the places, the pressure coming from the developer, and also the local government, just basically working with the developer and to develop those new projects.
Just to comment, Yuri, because I think you're referring to the Haiti case, the Citadelle La Forêt. It's a very outstanding monument, but one of the challenges the local people have, who've had, income because they maintain the horses, and it generally takes 3 young boys to guide you up the hill, one to kind of lead the horse, the other one to kind of motivate the horse from behind, and a bigger one to catch you if you fall off. But it's a unique experience. And now we have Royal Caribbean, with their Labadee, playground, really. It's a very, very extensive facility with all kinds of activities and restaurants and so on. But there's a road being built which will give access to the Citadel in about 45 to 50 minutes. And some of the surveys have shown that up to 10% of close to 900,000 visitors want to visit the Citadel. So in order to do that, Royal Caribbean, as an external, force, is trying to influence the development of transportation, modes, mass transportation type modes, which could completely destroy that local economic benefit for the local people. At the same time, some of the villagers in the area are trying to develop kind of like Main Street type programs as well. So a lot of challenges here, but I think the issue in Haiti is which is going to prevail, the commercial interest or the local concerns. Now, is there a way of handling both? I think there is, because there's access, to the Citadel by walking trails. There could be access through maybe a certain early type of visit, that could be with the guided horses. Maybe there can be some larger, groups facilitated. So a lot of issues, but it all comes down to the kind of, planning structure that allows for discussion, decision-making, and involves the government. But the problem is that local people don't really have the strong voice. So you could imagine Royal Caribbean, with their 900,000 visitors, are going to have a very strong voice in this whole issue. Now, we also have the World Heritage from Paris coming in and trying to motivate this. We have a major World Bank project that's now been funded, trying to introduce a management system for the Citadel and the related areas. And then we have also the Inter-American Development Bank trying to develop a destination management company. I only mention this, Yuri's doing all this, but many of you may not understand, the dynamic pressures, but Haiti is in great need of economic growth and development, part of the post-recovery, from the earthquake, and the north is ideally situated for recovery. There's air service, there's a proximity to Dominican Republic, Puerto Plata. So many issues right there in that one particular case that hopefully we can help resolve with further compromise, planning, decision-making.
Don, if you don't mind answering, I'd like to know a little bit more about how you're coordinating across governments, getting them to think about shared heritage. And so I'm going to pass the mic to you to answer that, if you don't mind.
We had a number of references to the Republic of Georgia, and I've been able to work through Solimar International on World Bank project in 3 of the provinces, and ways in which we've been able to engage local people, particularly in cultural heritage restoration activities like the adaptive reuse of buildings for commercial purposes. One of the frustrations that we've had, however, is that the World Bank tends to want, not because of the bank officials themselves, but because the local government really wants hard infrastructure. They want roads, they want different physical facilities. And of course, they want the restoration, which was essential to develop the tourism potential. But frustratingly, our team always recommended more on the soft side, institutional development, human resource development, coordination, planning capacity, destination management, and even marketing. And what happened with the first one, which resulted in $60 million loan from the World Bank, plus another 20-some million from the bilateral donors, almost an $80 million level of effort. The restoration work went forward, but the soft side was reduced to almost a trickle of funds. So what happened is you had all of a sudden, restored towns and villages, but no market. Why? Because nobody did any, institutional development for the marketing. They didn't have the human resource development, together. And that's one of the frustrations I have with many of the bilateral and the multilateral aid agencies. And I don't trace that to the staff that are putting the programs together, but it's the government. The government, it's their loan, so they have to make the final decisions. So I think more so we need to invest on the soft side of development. It needs to be parallel and coordinated with the hard infrastructure.
Thanks.
My name is Evan Burke, and I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Eastern Samar, which is part of the Philippines that was directly impacted by Typhoon Haiyan back in 2013. One of my friends there is the Secretary of Tourism for Eastern Samar, and one of the big issues that they've had is there was a big investment in tourism before the typhoon, and the typhoon destroyed pretty much all that investment, all hotels. There were many investments from local people there through remittance, and that was all destroyed. And so in the case of climate change and climate-related disasters, which are often recurring year after year, how can you talk about sustainability and sustainable tourism when there may not be much sustainability possible.
You know, it's actually a great question to ask, and I think this is something that we are going to be involved with more and more as we go forward, because whenever we have activities around climate change, the question is sustainability over time. And by the way, just as a quick footnote, in projects going forward that the bank is involved with, we have to specifically check a box, and I know that sounds not very important, but it actually has a lot of ramifications in every project that's designed to answer whether or not climate change issues have been addressed and whether or not this activity going forward has an opportunity to help mitigate climate change. So just that in one way becomes a very central area of focus, even though it's sort of indirectly, but nonetheless is quite important. In terms of sustainability, I think you raise another issue, which is we often look at sustainability from the standpoint of economically viable and economically productive, which is what I emphasize, but also as it relates to both cultural heritage preservation as well as conservation, and then all the environmental issues that we get into. So I think that there isn't an answer to your question from the standpoint of is there, again, a set formula, but really I think what we're looking at more and more, and Dr. Hawkins also alluded to this even in terms of the Haiti example, is that we have to be much more holistic and integrated in our solutions. And the comment that I made about, really making sure that when we look at tourism, that it's tied into contributing to developing answers and solutions for the development issues that we face globally. In some ways, we had for many years the luxury of saying, well, it's about supply and demand, and how many tourists can we get to go to these destinations, and how many communities can be involved. We still need to do that, but we also need to do it on a much more sophisticated level and a much more integrated level to address just the kinds of things that you've raised. And we can even take it a step further in terms of as we look at conflict. I mean, the issue right now in terms of all of the refugees coming out of Syria and resettling in the Middle East, the average median length of time that a refugee stays wherever they go to is 7.5 years. And so that raises all sorts of issues around relocation and whether it's visitor services, but the coming and going, and how do we integrate that into our tourism thinking, which it's not getting on buses, but it's another whole issue. So, thank you.